Welcome to All Souls Unitarian-Universalist Church. I'm Reverend Steve Wilson. I'm delighted to be here and be your host today. In this congregation, we believe that it's up to each of us to reach out and make sure everyone feels welcome. So take a look around and just do a little greeting of the people that are near you in whatever the tradition is here. I just want to inform people if there's going to be a fight that breaks out, I'm on the side with all the people in the pew. We're going to take you guys on. And so there's going to be, if anyone's interested, there's going to be a talk back afterwards about kind of Unitarian Universalism in general and maybe membership and how this organization might try to grow, and it'll kind of be what amounts to an extension of the service. So this service, minus any readings and the glad and sad candles part and the singing and the playing and the part when I try to make you laugh and hit you up for cash, the majority of the service is about us as a movement. Kate sort of invited me to try to do kind of a writ large UU service that got us off somewhat at the start of the church year here, and I'm giving myself permission not to do anything terribly sermonic. I've written what I call UU Roundup. It's as a summary, as sort of I ask myself, what would you say if you had a 15-minute elevator speech about how to explain Unitarian Universalism? So that is what I've done, and you will be punished for it. I encourage us all to stand as we are willing and able and join in for 121, We'll Build a Land. We're going to do the first, second, and fourth verses. First, second, and fourth. We'll build the land, 1, 2, 1.
We'll build a land where we wind up broken. We'll build a land where the captives go free. All of gladness is all morning. Oh, we'll build a promise that can be. From the land where sisters and brothers, anointed by God, may then create peace. Where justice shall go down like waters, peace like an ever-flowing stream. Second verse. We'll build a land where we bring the good tidings to all the afflicted and all those who mourn, and would give them garlands instead of ashes. Oh, we'll build a land where peace is born. Oh, build a land where sisters and brothers, anointed by God, may then create peace, where justice shall roll down like waters, and peace like an ever-flowing stream. Fourth verse. Build a land where the mantles of praises resound from spirits once fake and once weak, where like oaks of righteousness and redemption, oh, we'll build a land, my people we sing. Come build a land, sisters and brothers, anointed by God, may then create peace, where justice shall roll down like waters, and peace like an ever-flowing stream. My mother asked me one time, she said, does that new girlfriend of yours like the way you sing? And I said, yeah, she does. And she goes, she must like you.
I invite Jean Hall to come forward and light our chalice for us. I'm going to read these words, and they sort of frame this way, that whether you're a theist or a non-theist, there's an innate truth that everything comes together. It's part of the collective spiritual tradition of all churches, that in the end, whether it's physics or by God, somehow everything is essentially one. Hear those words. Thou art the path and the goal all paths never reach. Thou feedest and sustainest all that one sees or seems to. Thou art the trembling grass and the tiger that creeps under it. Thou art the light in sun and moon, the suns fade into silence, and the sanctity of sacred books. Thou art the good that destroys evil. All that is, in the end, one. All the struggles to light the chalice, all part of one. Please join me in our congregational covenant, which is printed in our order of service here. In this house, we covenant with one another to create a community built on a foundation of love, to work together to promote equality, justice, and peace, accepting responsibility for our individual acts, to stand on the side of love, embracing the liberation of oppressed minorities, and working to end discrimination and unjust privilege, to communicate with kindness and support, and to serve with compassion and commitment, to listen respectively and value our diversity as a source of our collective strength, to learn and grow together, generously sharing our time, talents, and treasures, to celebrate the joys of discovery from the wonder of youth to the wisdom of age, and to openly share our laughter and our tears, showing reverence for the divine in all that is. That's a lot to commit to. It is, but it's a great challenge. Eric Walker Wickstrom writes this prayer. Let's find a still spot to fall into. Tillich talks about dropping, that God isn't so much the heights but the depths, and I think prayer suits that well. Eric Walker Wickstrom says, Spirit of life known by many names, yet by no name fully, we gather together today with hopes and dreams and also fears and wounds. May we be reminded that all things come and go, that today's joys and today's sorrows will in time give way to those of tomorrow, that those of us who have strength to share today ought to do so while we can, and that those who are in need ought to allow themselves to receive for tomorrow, for those roles may well be reversed. Spirit of life, Mother and Father of us all, help us to remember those who are not here with us today, those who need what we have found here, and those who have what we need here too. May we always be open to growth and change, to movement, and to the workings of grace. In the name of all that is holy, and in all the holy names that have ever been uttered, let us enter a moment of silence with the words, Blessed be, Shalom, and Amen. We say a prayer that this institution thrives to grow and be the space in the community that it is for food, and may our strength and openness support this great county seat. John Coronado writes this responsive reading. I encourage you to participate in it. You have the simple repeating line. Here we go. We believe there is a place at God's table for each and every child of earth.
Hey, ain't that good news?
We believe the giver of life has been given many names and loves the givers of them.
Hey, ain't that good news?
We are more interested in getting heaven into people than getting people into heaven.
Hey, ain't that good news?
We believe religious scriptures are open doors rather than sealed vaults.
Hey, ain't that good news?
We believe there's still some holy writ yet to be written.
Hey, ain't that good news?
We believe that true evangelism is more preaching practiced than practiced preaching.
Hey, ain't that good news?
We believe justice is not just a word, but a reality we shape with our lives. We believe in one race, the human race. We believe we are one with the stars and trees and tigers and rivers and all the stuff of life. We believe our lives are about growing hearts that love, minds that seek, and hands that serve. Amen. Amen. That's all you'd really ever have to say, right? I mean, if we could follow it. It's now time for our offertory, which this church is smart enough to put before the sermon, so people are still motivated to give. And it's a story that's told. There was a preacher, and she was completing this temperance sermon back in the day. Probably was a he. I switched it to make it sound more modern. With great expression, she said, "If I had all the beer in the world, I would take it and throw it in the river." The congregation enthusiastically nodded their approval. "Amen, Pastor," they said. With even greater emphasis, she said, "If I had all the wine in the world, I'd take all those bottles and I'd throw them or dump them in the river too." The people clapped and were saying, "Amen, preacher, preach it." And then finally she concluded, "If I had all the bottle of whiskeys I could ever find, I'd take them down to the river and dump that devil liquid right into the water." The crowd was aroused, the pastor sat down, and the song leader, choir director, sheepishly stood up and quite cautiously announced the closing hymn, "Shall we gather by the river?" So there we are. was pretty. It felt like a, like jazz brunch, right? Really pretty. Let's imagine we're at a jazz brunch, tinkling piano music in the back, and you, not knowing what you're going to get, ask me about the Unitarian Universalist tradition. Let's just set that context there for fun. One might say that today is dedicated to a celebration of a denomination, right, or an explanation of the denomination for anyone who might be new or just wanting a little renewal review. But the church, our church, is not particularly part of, no UU church is part of a denomination. We are calling ourselves the denomination felt and sounded too restrictive to those who set the polity of this church. We're part of an association of congregations. See, you might have learned something already. We're not really a denomination. The UUA is an association of congregations of which we are members of that individual congregation. So if anybody ever says to you, if you ever try to talk them into coming to church and they say, I don't really like organized religion, you can tell them that we're really not that organized. UUs are too independent to even agree that we're part of something together. Which, if you've been around, would actually make you chuckle, as many of you did. Within each Unitarian Universalist church stands on its own traditions in a way, and collectively to some degree others, of course. It's responsible, every church is responsible for its own budget, hires and fires ministers within the freedom of a certain pre-vetted system for the most part, and in general, for better or worse, fails or succeeds on its own. I had begun somewhere around, that's what polity is. Polity is the way that a church structure governs itself in the broadest sense. And it is not completely true that we're completely free. We do have some constraints, supports, and responsibilities to our other Unitarian Universalist churches. But more than other groups, we stand alone. We share that with Congregationalists, of which we inherited that tradition from essentially the earliest pilgrims here. And we also share it with Baptists, two mainline traditions that stand in some level of lineage with that kind of independence. We were the Christians that left England to go to Holland, that came here, that wanted religious liberty for themselves, and then proceeded to deny it to others. But that's for another day. We are descendants of that religious ilk. We have that independence. It's part of why Unitarian Universalists organizing them is a little bit like herding cats, as they say. So we here are American UUs. This is very much a lecture, so don't expect you're going to be spiritually charged by too much, just so you know. We're Americans here in the Northeast region. We used to be, there's only 5 or 6 regions now. We used to be in the Clara Barton district when the UUA divided up things into much smaller packages. We were even divided from Massachusetts. Now we're all part of New England together. And although the main divisions, they've tried to work that out for political purposes as to structure, as to how to best serve the congregations. They now have bigger staffs within the regions, but they're further apart. So the relationships are a little thinner. Most of the districts, like the Clara Barton district, have sort of slowly disbanded. So we have a regional structure nationwide. To broaden up our structure, we used to be connected to the UUA, used to be connected to the Canadian churches. There's about 3,000 or 4,000 Canadian Unitarian Universalists. But back in 2002, they were tired of the discussion being so American-centric, and they decided to leave. Pretty quickly, the Canadians replaced the symbol of the chalice with a Molson beer sitting on a Montreal Canadiens hockey coaster, and swapped out the lighting of a candle with the start of their services by ritualistically throwing a piece of that round Canadian bacon into a hot frying pan. That's a lie, of course. But since this is a relatively dull topic, I thought I'd animate it a little bit. So more or less, outside of, we are obviously, the UUA is an American tradition and Unitarianism, and even more so, Universalism were American-born things. That's a little bit debated. We'll get into some of the history in just a second. Around the world, there are Unitarian Universalist communities in kind of pockets that are sort of odd and hard to predict. Many of them started in Europe. Those that are in Europe often have Reformation-era histories. The British Unitarians had a great start. The most famous of them all, probably for us now, are the Transylvanians, which were in Hungary but are now in Romania. That is probably the largest density of Unitarians or Unitarian Universalists around the world. They are Unitarians. There's about 100 churches in the Transylvania area, with about, the older measurement was about 75,000 people. So in an area, there are Unitarians. They're very much more Christian than we are. I was there almost 20 years ago. Women and men sat separately in the pews. It has a very early Christian Unitarian quality to it. That group was started by a prophet named Francis David, from which we inherit that great line, we need not think alike to love alike, right? Sort of the earliest stamp of tolerance that we've embraced moving forward. There's a scant community in Poland. There's different kind of expat communities in Germany and France. There's also a few heroes from that time that we inherit. Servetus was Spanish and then lived all around Europe kind of in hiding. He was always in trouble with authorities, in particular John Calvin, who eventually burned him at the stake, and it is from Servetus that we get our anti-Trinitarian Reformation history. Who here has sort of heard of Servetus? Kind of a famous story. If you ever want to read a great story, there should be a movie made about him. He's an amazing person, really smart, couldn't keep his mouth shut. Further east, there are two significant communities in India. The one in Madras is in the south. They're sort of smaller. There's a couple hundred members there. But up in the northeast states, if you ever look at a map of India, there's a little curvy part that sort of sits out over Bangladesh. It's a kind of odd part of India's general diamond. And in there, the British Unitarians, when they were doing their empire building, they basically were encouraging groups. At this point, they were Khasi tribal people. And there are a large number, there's probably about 5,000 Khasis who are now Unitarians and receiving connections to both British and American roots. So I've been there, very rural part of India, very Christian in their orientation as well. Britain is, at last check, has about 3,000 Unitarians and about 125 congregations. Germany has less than 1,000. And Indonesia and the Philippines, they're two relatively new upstart groups that come from the American side of Unitarian Universalism. In Australia and around the globe, there's smatterings of that kind of stuff. Back here on our soil, we merged in 1961. Anyone who's attended a UU church would know that. And that's a relatively long period. Most of us are Unitarian Universalists. There's still some churches in America that define themselves as Unitarian or Universalist, but that split and that essentially there was sort of a rift. Universalists tended to be a little bit more Christian. They tended to be founded in rural areas. Since Universalists accurately to a degree believe that the merge of the two traditions resembled a little bit like an acquisition or a takeover, Unitarians, of course, were bigger and they were wealthier and they got the front end of the name, which often gets shortened, right, in our clumsy name. But Universalists at one point in the mid-1800s, had as much as 15% of the US population in its ranks. So of all of the two traditions, there was one great moment for Universalism, and either Jefferson or Lincoln had said that by the end of the century, by the end of the 1800s, he believed every American would have been a Universalist. That idea that founded Universalism in areas just like the Connecticut Valley was a response to the Second Great Awakening and the idea that we were sinners in the hands of an angry God. They also saw, what Unitarians saw was that it wasn't so much being saved as much as it was the slow development of one's character that mattered. And they had a strong belief that God was more loving than judgmental, right? That kind of classic common sense wisdom that someone who never heard Jesus' name and really never had the cultural chance to be saved in a Christian sense would never be damned to hell by a loving God. What makes complete sense to us, even as many of us being non-theists, was part right there in that time. And universalism lost its initial push because most of the Christian churches moved from sort of the idea that we were sinners into the idea that God was a little bit more loving, and the Universalists lost their sort of single hold on a good idea. There was, at the time of the merger, there's another lie headed your way, just to keep it interesting. There was the original logo was two yellow U's that sort of joined at the top and looked very much like the McDonald's symbol if you flip them over. And we had to give up that logo in order not to be sued. Just trying to keep it interesting. At the time of the merger, that we inherited a few things that go back in time. It was about the time of the merger that we got the chalice as a symbol of starting the service. That had come out of World War II. It was a symbol. It's been used by the disciples of Christ. By the idea of a candle in a bowl is a fairly primitive symbol. Catholics, most religious traditions have some form of candle lighting as part of their ceremony. But that was also a religious symbol for people escaping Europe, right? So the service committee had something like that, along with a little bit of like a medical symbol. It was on the gate of a particular safe house and hospital in Europe. So we inherit the chalice, not too far and different in time than the time in which we come up with our 7 principles. So, let's see. The catchy fun phrase historically has been that Universalists believe that God was too good to damn humans to an eternal hell, and Unitarians, being a little bit haughtier, believe that we humans were just too good to be damned to hell. So those ideas kind of merged together, and we were compatible, culturally different movements throughout our time. So they both start, our histories of Unitarians and Universalists really mostly get their kickstart at the start of the 1800s, Universalism a little bit earlier, and then Unitarianism in about 1819 officially become Unitarians. And those movements coincided compatibly. Their ideas were not that different, but they were culturally different, right? Unitarians were more urban, a little bit wealthier and more highly educated. Universalists were a little bit more rural. So we have always been a little bit at the point of the religious arrow where new cultural truths meet religious history. That's really our job. Our job is to take a new truth, for example, like the equality of all people on the LGBTQ spectrum, right? And incorporate that into religious life. We're generally the first church group that does that. Historically, before any of this happens in America or around the globe, if we step back in time, we have roots that connect us back to the earliest Christian time. Unitarians were, across our history, sort of slurred by Christians as being too Jewish. There were groups called Sabbatarians back in the time of the Reformation and all along, but because Unitarians, right, the very word, have essentially, when we were strictly theists, had more of a Jewish identity of God, right? There was God, the Father, sort of exclusively, and then there were series of prophets of various levels of importance, from Moses to David. So our Unitarian Christian history, particularly with Arius, had Jesus not up with God at the point of creation, but more of a human mentor guide than kind of a cosmic savior who helped co-create the world. So that decision, Christianity and a lot of variety within it, took place, there was a lot of variety in Christianity for the first 200 or 300 years, and then Constantine wanted to make it the Roman emperor's religion, and he imposed orthodoxy upon a group of people that were otherwise kind of arguing and fighting about what the nature of Jesus was in relationship to the history of God. So We lost that debate. We basically lose every debate all along through history about whether God was, everyone got saved or not. The church father Origen was a very respected church father of that period of time, the patriarchal period of time. Not that it hasn't always been completely patriarchal, but no, there's a period of time for that. And as we go along, right, there wasn't a lot of religious flowering up to the time of the Reformation. At the time of the Reformation, there was a whole bunch of religious flowering when people read the Bible in their own languages, and we were part of that as well. That's where we get the Transylvanian history. We get John Biddle in England. We get Servetus questioning the nature of popes and the nature of the Roman Church as being the sole authority. At every turn, it is in our nature to work to incorporate new truths that our species are kind of beginning to get a hold of and work them into our religious lives. It's probably our most common feature, right? You see that in anti-racism. We're the group pulling that in as fast as we possibly can. Jumping back to the 7 principles and to the time in 1961 when we came together, I'm kind of jumping around here because I'm freelancing a little bit on my sermon. The 7 principles were originally thought they were written with a very patriarchal style of language, and we added the 6 sources because there was so much debate about that we were losing our Judeo-Christian heritage, right? When people look at who we are and our sources, the basic understanding is that we're a tree. That's the common image. And the trunk of the tree is the Judeo-Christian truths, right? Kindness to your fellow human beings, that kind of some of the core things that are almost universal. And then they flower out as we get in and start to embrace truths of Buddhism, right? The Hindus, John Adams, Unitarian, had the largest Hindu Eastern theological library in the country at that time. So we've always been sort of forward-minded in that particular way. So they ground together to put the 7 principles together. It was 6 originally, and they had a lot of male language in there. We have built our tradition to have natural revisions in those core things like the principles, and every 15, 20 years we revise them. We've revised them to be less sexist, and we've revised them to be more ecological, right? So the merger in 1961 precedes the women's movement, and it precedes the Earth First kind of ecology-minded Earth Day mentality that we realized we were really destroying the planet. So we've incorporated that, added the 7th principle, and interestingly enough, as we were much of the debates about whether we would add the 8th principle, right, an explicitly anti-racist principle, we're in the process of another one of these revisions, and this year, and the next GA, they're going to undo the principles. Did anybody know that? General Assembly, I'll get to that in a second. So General Assembly is the annual meeting that we have historically had since General Assembly, and I believe beforehand when we were just Unitarians, or I don't know about the Universalists, but General Assembly is a national gathering. There's usually historically been 3,000 or 4,000 people, and that is the time in which we revise all of our understandings, and some of the new curriculum come out, and it's just a big gathering of people. It's taking place in different places across the country in order to make sure it's accessible to every single person. But at the moment, the largest thing that's going on in our denomination is this debate about whether we're going to undo the principles and replace them with essentially much more of a visual image with love in the center and words like justice surrounding it that simplify it and make it a little bit more tenable to a visual generation of people. So it's stylistic as much as it's any kind of theological shift. Whew. All right, let's see. Anti-racism is built right into that. So here's some enduring tensions that make Unitarian Universalists who we are. What we essentially squabble about internally is always theology, right? Historically, there's been tensions that people who are more Christian feel like we're losing our way and sort of have lost that. I think largely that debate is particularly pretty much over. There aren't too many exclusively parochially Christian people left in Unitarian Universalist churches anymore. If you want to ask that question or get at the heart of that debate, the best way to capture whatever disagreement might be lingering is to ask yourself or ask your fellow Unitarian Universalists whether our Judeo-Christian heritage is unique among our influences or it is not anymore. If you ask yourself that question, you might get to the confusion that helps define the tension of who we are. About 15 years ago, we had a debate about how comfortable we'd be with language of reverence. Bill Sinkford, who was the president at the time, was in a lot of conversations with other religious leaders, and our strict humanism, right, that decision to be humanistic, which many people who've been historically Unitarian Universalists feel like is being lost and faded, that commitment to reason, right, has been in part, that the commitment to reason is in part been challenged by the fact that people historically mostly went to church in America in much larger numbers. So we would draw in the least religious group of people as sort of our source of who joined our churches. Culturally, as people don't go to church anymore, the default now is to not be connected to a church. The number of people who are non-affiliates is growing exponentially. In fact, every 10 years, the number of people who are not connected to a religious faith, don't label themselves as Baptists or Unitarian Universalists or whatever, doubles. And that has been taking place since about 1990. That is the area in which we have our most access to people, right? The great crime of Unitarian Universalism, or the great plague of our tradition, is that more and more people think like us every day, are aware of kind of the way that we look at the world religiously, pluralistically, but they don't come to church anymore, right? So it's just the greatest tease there ever was, because if people started to go back to religious institutions and churches, we would be full. We're losing we are the very people who are departing from the very institution of attending churches. Politically, there's always also been some tension within our churches as to how publicly out there we're going to be on a particular issue and what the process is within each congregation to speak about those issues. Vietnam was the classic example of that, right? Many activists in Unitarian Universalist churches opposed the Vietnam War, and many people at that time within the churches didn't feel like the church could speak on that issue in any one particular direction. So there's always political tension about how political our church can be. And there's also a great tension within us because we have this great commitment to freedom of thought, and we have this great commitment to doing justice. And those are mostly compatible across time, but there are tensions there, right? If someone believes that, like, how comfortable is anyone in the church who would be a Republican, right? The number of Republicans in our denomination has declined over the last 25 years, pretty precipitously. Back even 25 years ago, there was a fair number of people who voted, identified themselves as sort of socially liberal, economically conservative. Those numbers have declined dramatically over the last time. And inside churches, we always, as you all know, probably feel it, you have this debate about how much we're a warm, insular community to ourselves and care about one another, and how much we are to be of a broad and welcoming service to the world. There's not much debate about that, but it is stylistic, right? How much of the sense that I am with my people, I am with my peeps, and the assumption that we need to be welcoming to others, and that obviously has political tones as well to it. Another tension within our movement that defines us uniquely is that we tend to be intellectually sort of radical. We tend to be very forward-thinking and accepting of truths, but sociologically because we generally are among the wealthiest and most highly educated groups of people in any church. We share the highest per capita average income with Episcopalians and Reformed Jews. There is a comfortableness to many Unitarian Universalists, right? We sort of have been part of the establishment. We're comfortable. The tension between whether we should be protesting in the streets or writing academic theses and, just enjoying vacations, right? We're the only church, we're the first and predominantly the church tradition that gives ourselves the summer off. The joke has been that we're the only tradition that God trusts to give the summer off to. But it also speaks to our nature, right? Part of that trend began with people in New England, because we started here, being comfortable enough to go into cooler places than where they often were, to travel, to spend the 11 decent weekends we have in the course of a year somewhere cooler, right? That is a privilege and a culture that sort of, you can speak to our prophetic nature. The abolitionist movement and slavery was a great example of that, right? We were generally on the abolitionist side, some bravely, but we were also linen owners who owned factories in Lowell that held back that restraint. So there's always natural tensions there. About 50, is this helpful or no? Okay. Okay, thanks. So Vietnam cost Unitarian Universalist churches a lot of members because that division broke the church and drew people away, right? People have, more than we would like to admit, fragile relationships with their churches. The 80s were a little bit of a dip. As the late 90s came around and we embraced the LGBT concerns and pushed for marriage equality and those rights, and we did some actual advertising in magazines like Time Magazine, we had a little bit more of a boom, and we were growing somewhere between about 98, I'm playing with the numbers a little bit, but roughly like from the late 90s to about 2010, we grew by about one member per church across the country. We grew in most of the states. New England lost its membership. We are departing from churches, but people are also moving more to the Southwest, and we were beginning to get a little bit more ethnically diverse. We've added Hispanics in fairly decent numbers to our ranks. We almost always, across the board have added retirees and women. They are the people who, look around at the crowd, right? People who are just at the edge of retirement into their older years. White women we always do really well with that demographic. We've actually, interestingly enough, lost African Americans in our community up to maybe the last couple years. I don't have the statistics on that. But we've grown in certain areas where people have moved to, right? And some of that has to do with dynamic leadership and, those kind of things. Our largest church is in Tulsa, Oklahoma. No one would ever think that. So we are shrinking at the moment, and that is a trend that is probably the most important trend that we face at the moment. COVID obviously didn't help. The numbers in our religious education programs for children are scary. We between 2010 and 2020 had a 40% decline in enrollment in our children's religious education programs nationwide. It's hard to know really where we've been from COVID. We haven't been out of it long enough. Pew, who does most of the great demographic studies of religion, has us as we're less than 1/4% of American people. And they do that. They do the most significant deep dive into all of that. Again, it is Pew that has identified the largest growing number. We can talk about the fundamentalists and their active political nature and how everybody thinks they're, we tend to think that everyone who's not here is part of a megachurch. It's not true. The largest number of people are non-affiliates. And there are two kinds of non-affiliates out in the world. There are people who actively do not want to be a part of a church. They're generally atheistic. And there are groups who are just sort of not connected, but spiritual, right? Spiritual but not religious people. I'm a little lost here in my notes, but that's fine. BeliefNet.com is a place that you can go do a survey, and they were helpful in pulling some people into our Unitarian Universalist churches as well. So people went on to BeliefNet. It was kind of a thing people did 10, 15 years ago. And you took a survey to find out what you were. Here's how BeliefNet determined and described what Unitarian Universalists are. I think you're going to like it. 1, the universe is a beautiful, intricate, complex place, the foundations of which are a mystery. The whole truth being too large, our minds, knowledge, intuitions, and institutions too small to grasp it all. Therefore, we cherish and learn from diversity. 2, if the universe can be said to have a purpose, if it can be said, its purpose is for us, not against us, and it is for all of us, not any exclusive group. 3, given how little we can know for sure, our focus should be on this earth and life, beauty, justice, and love. 4, we claim the rational, eschew the irrational or the things that are contrary to reason, and question the non-rational, which is neither provable nor disprovable by reason alone, for example, life after death. Poetically, it might be stated this way. Unitarian Universalists believe we come from one origin, are headed to one destiny, but we cannot know completely what these are. So we are to focus on making this life better for all of us, and we use reason when we can to find our way. That's pretty accurate. We got to this place by a series of oddities, I think. Our reason and tolerance, which is sort of the most famous thing that we are probably to people, kind of came about by a matter of us being unwilling to generally kick people with different ideas out. Theodore Parker back in the 1830s had a large following of people. He was much more of a deist than they were comfortable with at the time. There was efforts to get him kicked out of the standing order of ministers, but they didn't quite have the gumption to do that, and people would essentially just not invite him to preach in their church. We, being historically heretics, right, often coming from other faiths and often being from divergent, right, minority groups, have a distaste for saying, no, you're not acceptable to us. It's part of our ethos, and the polity, the way that our congregational life set at each level, with the church having flexibility to do whatever it wants to do, its non-hierarchical nature, combined with our capacity to come from these places where no can mean a death sentence, both historically and in practical terms, has made us much more fluid. Fundamentalists would say snakes are fluid too, but we would say to that, well, snakes are part of the interdependent web of all creation, so that's fine with us. So, again, I spoke about General Assembly. That's most of our, let's see, what else is there to say? We're not very pious. I'll close. Here we go. I think we've said enough. You made it all the way to church. At least you should feel something by the end of a sermon. We're small, but we are unique. There is quite nobody really like us. Around the globe, in every religious tradition, there are people who have taken the stance to step a little bit away from the core tradition they are a part of. Sufis come to mind. The Brahma Samaj in India and Asia comes to mind. But across the globe, there are very few movements or institutions that have made such a peaceful and significant transition in their positions without conflict or rancor. We, our ancestors, we created the division of church and state, or had a lot to do with that in Gloucester when we protested the idea you had to pay taxes for churches you weren't a part of. We're among the first religious institutions to fight for the rights of the LGBTQ community. Our ancestors fought to have science taught in the schools And after a little lag time, many of our ancestors on the Unitarian side, who were still making a lot of money in the slave trade and the cotton business, basically came upon us. We have a history of being proactive around women's rights. We have a disproportionate number of leaders, senators, etc. We have been the group that has always fight to draw more people into the circle of care and concern. And isn't that really the only answer we have as a species moving forward? Our institution and our brothers and sisters around the world are ahead of the curve on how the world needs to go. We're practical people with a spiritual core, with an eye to justice, and isn't that really what the world needs? We see the future, and it looks at least a little bit like us. Amen. Okay. It's now time for joys and concerns. And Kate's going to run the microphone around, and I encourage people to, I forgot how you did joys and concerns, but you'll do it in the way that you do it. Thank you.
And this is an opportunity for folks who are visiting us today to introduce themselves. We look forward to saying hello. Emma.
Yeah, I'm Emma, and I haven't been here a lot because I was taking care of my mom who turned 100 in June. She had a wonderful 8-month run where she was with us for several months and with her niece and my sister for several months. And then just 2 weeks ago, she fell, and we think it was from dizziness from a stroke, and she had explicitly said many, many times that if anything happens to my brain, I just want to pass. She enjoyed sermons, and particularly one where you interviewed Jesus over Zoom, and we had discussions and so forth, and I think she passes as a Unitarian-Universalist. I'd like to light a candle for her easy and quick passage.
Thank you.
And all the joy she brought into the world.
Andrew Baker, I just want to say, hey, ain't that good news? Thank you, Steve.
Thanks.
Morning, my name's Russ. Please light a candle for me. I'm feeling a lot of sadness and recognizing loss, a lot of things in my life now, and anticipating coming here this morning. I thought about saying something, and just having other people hear me helps. Thank you.
If you would light a candle of joy for I'm Kate Mason, and Jim and I went up to Maine to visit with our Jim's daughter's family. They've got 6 kids. It is a crazy scene in their little house, and we had a great time. So much love. It's amazing.
Good morning, I'm Rob. I certainly want to strongly second Andrew's appreciation, and first time ever I've wished there would be more lies.
Hang around long enough, I tell plenty.
I'd like to light a candle of sorrow. Since coming back from Spain, there's been a lot of really heartbreaking things. And I'd also like to light a candle of joy, to have my buddy Brian here playing music, to have you in the pulpit, Steve, and to have a place where it is maybe you were feeling this too, Russ, but where it's safe to feel the sadness and also be able to touch the joy.
Morning, I'm Sandra, and I want us to light a candle for the truck drivers driving the supplies into Gaza, and for everyone who had influence in the opening of that gate. It's such a symbol of hope.
Yeah.
And Pam, if you could light one more candle for those unspoken joys and sorrows.
Sure. There's more here too, out in the crowd.
First, I want to thank Steve. I have never heard a history like that before. And I appreciate it. And I want to add a couple of things because they were so earth-shaking. And one is Vietnam War. We published the, what's it called? The World? No, we published the, the denomination published the entire history of the United States government intervening in Vietnam and went broke, almost completely broke, over the publication of the Pentagon Papers. Thank you. Fried brain is and then the one minister that was killed in crossing the Pettus Bridge, and about half the people who joined that crossing were Unitarian-Universalists. James Reeb and Viola. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But it's just these incidents don't stand separate. They're part of that huge energy that's used to confront the times that we live in. Thank you.
I'm Suzanne, and I come rarely, and I'm very glad. Thank you, Steve. I'm very glad to be here today. I'll start with the sadness and rage about the warring that's going on in Israel, Palestine, Gaza, and the West Bank. And I'm also grateful for all those that have been demonstrating around the world for peace, because most of us really want peace. And the stories I hear from individuals who are suffering from this, with their families being bombed, is just really, really hard to take. And so we all need to be standing up for peace for both countries. And a candle, please light a candle for joy. I have, this week, my third great-grandchild was born, Manny, in Washington State. So I've seen only photos. She's a strong, healthy little girl. And it's so wonderful to have these descendants, these children growing up with a lot of love and activity. So, yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Robin. I wanted to light a candle for the American Jews who are in an active process of inquiry and learning about expanding our understanding of our history and the history of the lands in the Middle East that are currently engaged in war and conflict. And just as I'm doing that process, finding people who are able to express very articulately in language that I don't hear usually. Usually it's very polarized language. It's the Israelis, the Palestinians. And hearing people finding ways to talk that feel more inclusive and more accurate to me. So I'm just appreciating that. And a personal joy is that in my quest for a religious or spiritual community like coming here, I've been wanting to find a Jewish home and not really identifying in the religious sense. I was invited to a ukulele havara. And a havara, as I understand it, is kind of a group of Jewish people coming together without one particular leader. And it was ukulele, so I said yes. And so it just felt really a lot of joy for being, going into a synagogue and being able to sing and play with a bunch of other beginners and feel a sense of belonging.
Anyone on Zoom have any joys and concerns to share? Okay. It is a tradition in this church to sing the friendship song, the prayer to friends, but we're going to sing, instead of that, we're going to sing Love Will Guide Us, all 3 verses. It's number 131. It's going to be played in a kind of bluesy style if Brian keeps to the practice runs. So you'll enjoy that. 131. Will guide us, peace has tried us, hope inside us, will lead the way on the road from greed to giving. Love will guide us through the hard night. If you cannot sing like angels, if you cannot speak before thousands, you can give from deep within you. You can change the world with your love. Peace has tried us, hope inside us, will lead the way on the road from greed to giving. Love will guide us through the dark night. I'm going to change, I'm not going to use Billie Holiday's words, I'm going to use Nancy Wood's words. She says, hold on to what is good even if it is a handful of earth. Hold on to what you believe even if it is a tree which stands by itself. Hold on to what you must do even if it is a long way from here. Hold on to my hand even when I have gone away from you. Go in peace. Oh, announcements. We'll have the postlude, and then we'll have announcements. And coffee, too. And then a discussion for those who wish to stay about more Unitarian Universalist stuff and membership, if anyone wishes to stay for that. So, we got a harmonica, I've heard. Is that true?
We're gonna lay down our swords and shields down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. We're gonna lay down our swords and shields down by the riverside. We ain't gonna study war no more. 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 Ain't gonna study war no more.
I always think if we studied war more, we would realize how stupidly ineffective it is. But that's just me. Time for announcements. Take it away, Kate. Pam.
Well, just one thing.
Give it a minute. It's on.
I'm Pam, and one really good thing is that, which we might not have said so far, is that we're believers in things that work. And, the good things that work. And so it's easy to get sunk into the misery of times, but it's much more effective to bring joy and concern and work on things that actually work. Therefore, we have a tree group that believes that because the science is so clear, we have the chance to pull 30% of the carbon out of the atmosphere if we work on trees. So we have a tree group. We're struggling to keep it rolling. We're busy, but you're welcome to join, and you can sign up right over there, and we'll tell you a tree thing is coming up next week.
On Saturday, 1 to 3 at Christine Bates' house. But she wants to keep the numbers low, so it's a secret.
No.
So we're treasuring
And we have a few more trees being planted elsewhere.
Yes, that's why I wanted to sign up so we can tell you what happened. It's the prayer of Christine.
So there's a Funeral Consumers Alliance meeting this afternoon at 2 in Northampton. If you want more information, let me know. Funeral Consumers Alliance. Funeral Consumers Alliance meeting in Northampton at 2 this afternoon. If you want more information, talk to me.
Could I put a PS then on? There's a possibility that what we need to do is actually save the trees that are 170 years old or more. So how can religious people, faith-based people do that? Could be by turning forests into green burial centers. We're exploring that idea. It's kind of just an idea at this point.
Anybody else? Russ.
I'll try to be quick. First, if you're here for the first time today, we'd really love it if you would put your name in our guest book in the entryway before you go. You don't have to say like why you're here or contact information unless you want that, but just to know that you came, we'd really appreciate that. Secondly, do have a couple of paper copies of Steve's sermon today. He printed these up himself, and they'll be out in the entryway if anybody wants to take them, take one. And lastly, there was a really nice service for Nancy Forrest this past Monday afternoon, where she was buried, a green burial in the West Leiden Cemetery. It's a beautiful spot. Some of us from All Souls went up there and even spoke. If anybody's interested in, going out there to pay their respects, it's a wonderful spot. Please ask me or Kate. We were both there. Thanks.
So, among so many reasons why I'm sad to lose Nancy, she was a really crucial part of our board, and we don't have many people on our board. So if there's any of you who would like to learn a little bit about serving on the board, there are relatively painless ways that you can just find out a little bit of what's involved. And if it is a place where you could bring your generosity and your thinking and your teamwork, it would be especially appreciated at this time, given that we're really down to very few of us doing it. And if you have an initial question or want to follow up on what I'm sharing, please, I'll stick around. I'm happy to speak to anybody more.
I'd be sort of curious if who's interested in maybe gathering up here after coffee hour for Steve, just so we know. Okay, so we got a little group. Great.
Yeah.
Good. So we have brownies, pumpkin cake, pumpkin raisin cake, and deviled eggs, and coffee, and tea. Come.
Thank you all. Thanks for coming.
Thought process that you're having, Ellen, and that most of us are having. Why would they throw away the sympathy card? They had it in spades. Why throw it away?
I actually think that's the least of it. It's where is your humanity? Where is your compassion?
Right.
What could you possibly achieve by destroying everything in Gaza? I don't, there may be people there that you're killing that would be of support of some kind of peace if you could let them have it. But now you're just making everybody angry, and everybody's grieving, and it's horrible. It's just horrible.
And all those rational thoughts seem to be lost on people who are highly traumatized, more than you and me. Right? You all have PTSD.
That was what Steve was saying about rational thought. There it is. There is no rational thought. Emotions are stronger than reason, and that's built into us as animals, as our very being, and so you can only fight with emotion, and the only emotion that can beat this is the emotion of love. And that's the hardest part.
It's interesting that Steve was talking about the difference between universalists and oh no, we couldn't hear you, Gary, before. But what's interesting is that the word universalism comes up in a lot of these discussions, describing people who see the solution as broadening identity to include all of humanity and getting rid of identities, or clinging to old identities like, my religion, that religion, Republican, Democrat, Arab and Jew. That's what in the public debate now, that's what they mean when they say universalist.
Yeah.
Is that liberals have been historically universalists in recognizing that human beings have wider sympathies than their own identity group. And the paradox of current progressive liberals in the United States, especially 19-year-olds at universities, is that no, identity politics is everything, intersectionality, et cetera, et cetera. And that's one of the theses that has it to me, it's rather like what happened to the American left communists in 1939 when Stalin made a pact with Hitler to let them both take over Poland. All of a sudden, it's like, oh, it's like, this isn't as good as we thought. And that really made the left in America take a different intellectual direction from then on. And that's been sort of forgotten.
But there were a lot of people, I had a school teacher who was basically blacklisted and lost her job because she'd been part of the American Communist Party. And there's online, I found a transcript of her being interviewed by the House Un-American Activities. It was just kind of incredible, to see that. And the nightmare of that too, that's somehow we make enemies out of people who think differently in a country where freedom of thought and if freedom of speech is not different from freedom of thought. If you have an idea, an opinion that is different than the mainstream, and you join a little club and you sign a piece of paper that says you went to this meeting, and then 20 years later they call you up and challenge you in by the Senate. I mean, what, or Congress, whatever it was. I was in like 6th grade, I was like, what is going on here? So this country's been very weird about communism.
Saying goodbye to Gary, I guess.
Gary, we hardly got to hear your voice.
Well, that's because I had my speaker on, which the separate speaker, which I forgot doesn't allow for me to speak. It just you know what I'm saying.
The technical term is that you don't have full duplex audio communication.
Yeah. Yes. It's actually,
I have to work
but
on
things sound better when I listen. So anyway, I have another Zoom that started, so I've got to run. Good to see you all, and until next time.
Yeah. Hi to Christy.
I gotta leave too.
Yeah.
By now, I don't want to. I want to blow all my sermon prep for. Well, I'm not sure I'll do this sermon for All Souls in November. Actually, there's a question about November. They had me booked for the first Sunday at All Souls, and I can't do the first Sunday at All Souls. I thought I was supposed to be there the second Sunday of November. So I'm hoping that she's working that out.
Yeah. All right. Because you won't even be here, right?
It's going to be by Zoom or in person?
No, I'll be in person at the two northern UU churches on the first. And then at All Souls, hopefully either the second or third Sunday.
Okay.
And that's the same time Steve is up at Bernardston on the second Sunday.
Right. We're trading off. He was the one who basically pioneered that whole, running from Northfield to Bernardston in the same day paradigm.
Yeah, that was.
And that's one of the reasons why Northfield starts at 10 a.m. It starts at 11:30. It's enough time for one minister to do the service and run down Route 10 and grab a donut and say the same sermon or a different sermon they prefer again.
And that's what you're doing the first weekend in November, is you're doing that double header of Northfield and Bernstein.
Which was at one point, we were, when we were talking about a shared ministry for the three churches, that was the proposal, was that, every other Sunday, it would be basically the minister we would hire as a group of three churches would only have to write maybe 2 sermons a month, but would deliver it, the first week, sermon A on the first Sunday at Bernstein and Northfield, and then to All Souls the next week, and then the next week to Bernstein Northfield, and I thought it'd be a great chance for a new minister just out of seminary to brush up their skills. It was interesting though. Who was our minister?
Georgianne Green?
Georgianne thought that would be too rigorous, and Steve and I both go, no, it's not. It does cut down on your First Parish in Northfield gets shortchanged somewhat of coffee hour when I have to run out afterwards. And coffee hour is really actually pretty important.
Yeah.
It's the communion.
But I bet that can't be the only reason that whole idea didn't take place. So can you help us understand why the three churches aren't collaborating and cooperating more in their best interests?
Well, it's part of what what Steve talked about, all, Unitarians actually having congregational polity and not a denomination, an association of congregations at the beginning of the sermon. They really want to preserve their independence and are afraid that they would lose that independence if we all join together. Of course, that's the weakness of independence, that you get to do what you want, but you don't have the power of everybody working together. And there are lots of other places you could coordinate on, like bookkeeping and housekeeping and building maintenance. If you could have a full-time building maintenance person for all three churches, and improve the thing a great deal. But the real reason it didn't work was actually the idea from the Ministers Association that we couldn't afford it. We couldn't afford it. Because when I put together a proposal, I put together it would be a $45,000 salary for the minister, and 30 grand of that would come from All Souls, and 15 from the 15 or 20 from the other two, because they're smaller congregations. But All Souls couldn't even afford the 30 at the time. Right. Now, after years of not having it, we probably could. But again, what happened is when we did hire Georgianne for that period, attendance didn't go up enough, pledges didn't go up enough to cover it. So after Georgianne for 2 years, we couldn't afford to have Georgianne for another. She quit, I think, seeing that reality. It's not like we said, we can't afford you. And she quit because she didn't feel, she wanted to have more, change the focus of her life away from ministry and more towards social action. So there's that, but it's possible.
It seems like during COVID, when we weren't in the church, we had people from all different congregations on at the same time, and that was kind of interesting. I don't know how you feel about that, but it was a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. That was an example. And if you go back to the days of what's her name? Some of the older church members said, during World War II, we did services together because there was, an energy shortage. And for a long time, they held summer services in what they call round robin, where they'd go around the three. In unity, there is strength. But then once you don't need to have strength, you get to do what you want, is the way it goes. I'm a denominationalist. And I think that the UUA has not been the association in Boston is like a separate world, and about 150 miles east of where I am now is a church that has broken ties with the UUA and is starting a new Unitarian association because they believe, well, their minister believes that the UUA has lost touch and is too woke, quote unquote. So that's a different issue altogether. But it's you're starting
A Unitarian using the word too woke, but okay.
Well, so what does it mean to be a denominationalist? I'm really curious to understand what you mean by that.
Yeah.
I think we should be a denomination and not this loose affiliation.
Yes. Well, and well, also that I would like to see us be a world religion instead of an American religion. I was at that General Assembly when the Canadian Unitarians left, and oddly, it was when the GA was in Quebec.
Wow.
And I'd gone up there with Jim Scott. We went up together to share expenses, and I was going, "You're going in the wrong direction here." There's no, you can't even keep the Canadians in the fold. What is wrong? And I disagree with the guy in Spokane about that. Very much so.
But more splitting off isn't the answer.
Well, right, yeah. And not only that, but liberals can't afford to, alienate anybody. But also I will blame the UUA basically blacklisted this guy, this minister, when he was, making his criticisms at the General Assembly 2 assemblies ago. And they way overreacted. They basically confiscated all of the books he had written and exiled him and the congregation. It sounded like somebody who had offended the Pope in Catholicism or something. It was really,
wow.
It was very ham-handed.
Yeah.
That's sad.
But denomination, I would like to see a religious movement, exactly what Steve said, which is actually more people believe what we believe now than ever before. Right. And it's like what we talked about, Carl, the last time, that it's people need that weekly reinforcement that there are good things about classical religious tradition, having an intellectual person that you pay to manage the flock, as it were, spiritually and intellectually, and having a community of people that gather, that's not work, that's not family, that's not government. To me, that's the fourth estate, is religion.
Right. And now we know that we can use it to rewire the neural pathways that actually create change in behavior.
Yes.
Most people left church because they understood that the finger wagging style of sermonizing doesn't actually make society better or our behavior. Right. But we now know that there are neuroscience activities that we can do with our brains for a few minutes, alone or together in church, that can help us all adopt the behaviors that the principles espouse.
Yeah.
That we can do it. And so I'm very sad that we have three congregations, that we have three UUs who can't practice their own principles enough to actually collaborate on some simple things like building maintenance and accounting and being together in
administration and everything else.
Way. What's that? Love is at the center.
This is part of the new thing that he was talking about that'll be voted on, love at the center. Yes.
Why would that replace the principles, though? That doesn't make sense to me.
They are going to run into issues. They're going to run into issues with that. But
looks like the principles are on there, interdependence and
right. This is sort of a rewrite of the principles and make them a little bit tighter and a little, like he said, a little bit more graphic.
So there's still principles and they're still written out, but they're more accessible to a less literate society.
Yes. Well, and it's interesting that equity, inherent worth and dignity is last in this now, but there's actually a graphic of this that has these equity, transformation, justice, pluralism, interdependence in a graphic with love at the center. So this is, and some of the churches out here in Seattle are doing that. So
it's not meant to be hierarchical in a vertical. It can be represented in a circle with love at the center.
When you see it, it's like, it's a bigger thing, yes. So,
well, it's great. I'm signing off. Gotta walk.
We gotta get going with our Sundays.
All right. See you guys. Thank you, Diane.
Does the eighth principle by Ellen, does the eighth principle still come in? The anti-racism? I just need to know that.
Oh, in fact, it's much more, it's like, equity means, the equity line says we build inclusive communities, and justice, we work to dismantle racism and oppression, co-creating a socially just world that works for everyone.
Okay, so they brought that in.
Yeah.
Folded that in.
Okay. You never will lose these 7 or 8 principles because there's all kinds of works of art that have been built around that, and it'll always be a part of our theological history. This is okay with me. We'll see. We'll see what happens.
Wow. So maybe you'll be preaching about that in November.
I might. Yeah.
Wow. Lots of choices. All right. It'll be great.
All right. Thanks, everybody. See you next week. Next week here in Greenfield. Next week in Greenfield.
You're actually going to be there in person.
Yeah.
Oh, we're at a family.
I'm asleep from jet lag.
Oh, we're in a family gathering up in Topsfield, Mass, all weekend. So I'm sorry that we'll miss seeing you there. But you'll be around for 2 weeks, right? You'll be around for.
I'll be around until 2 days before Thanksgiving.
Oh, good. So one way or another, we'll find.
If I can stand being away from my wife for that long,
or
my wife can stand me being away from her for that long.
That's sweet. That's
we'll
really
see.
Sweet.
It's a trial. It's
wow. That's very sweet. We'll see you one way or another. Tom says bye.
Bye, Tom.
Thanks for opening this room. It's really